So I'm doing a topic that's a little different because most Easter talks do not have an entire 40 minutes just on the burial of Jesus. Because I'm just going to be honest with you. It really should just be assumed, and it shouldn't be a controversial aspect or even really debated aspect of Holy Weekend, Passion Weekend. But here's the thing. My good friend Mike Lacona, who spoke this morning, he's going to speak this afternoon on the resurrection of Jesus. He and Gary Habermas, they've written a really fine book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. But in their book, and I kind of razz Mike about this, and even in Mike's 718-page door slammer called The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach, Mike gives about half a page to the burial in the empty tomb of Jesus. So, the burial of Jesus in the empty tomb, it's not considered one of the 5 minimal facts that is usually used to build the case for the resurrection of Jesus. You know what it is, right? Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples genuinely believed that he appeared to them alive. The conversion of the skeptic Paul went from being a persecutor of the church to becoming a believer because of his claim that Jesus appeared to him alive. The conversion of James, Jesus' skeptical brother, became a believer. And finally, the empty tomb. But before you can get to the empty tomb, you got to have a reliable burial tradition. It's kind of jumping the gun. So that's why understanding the burial is so important. Because no, it's not one of the minimal facts, but it's an essential fact. Tradition. So that's what I'm going to present on. And it's even more relevant because right now a number of popular skeptics have been disputing the historical reliability of the burial of Jesus. So, if Jesus died, good. If he was buried, wonderful. Then the tomb was empty, then he was raised. But if you skip the burial in the empty tomb, you got nothing. Christianity falls apart. So this is key to understanding the truthfulness of the Christian message. So was Jesus really buried? Did this really happen? Before I start, though, I want to tell a bit of a joke. So there was a man, and he was married to his wife, and she was a real nag. She got on his case all the time. They had a tough marriage. She got after him for everything, and he was up to here with her. So they were on a trip to the Holy Land. She always dreamed of going to Israel. So they saved up all their money, and they finally went to Israel. And they're in Jerusalem, and while they were there, the wife died. She died on their trip to the Holy Land. But she was a nag, and the husband wasn't too disappointed, unfortunately. So the undertaker told the husband, you can have her shipped home, or you can bury her here in the Holy Land for $150. What do you want to do? The man thought about it and told him, you know what? I'm going to pay the $5,000. I'm going to have her shipped home and buried back home. The undertaker asked, why would you spend $5,000 to ship your wife home when it would be wonderful for was church in Corinth, and he says, I pass on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received. And he says that Jesus died, was buried, and then was raised. So as Mike will probably explain later on, Paul received this tradition likely with most 5 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is extremely early tradition that goes back. James D.G. Dunn, who taught at the University of Durham, he dated the composition of the kerygma, of that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, that it must have been composed within about 6 months of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So it's extremely early. So the saying, Jesus died and then he was buried, goes back so early. Now, Paul also alludes to the burial of Jesus in Romans 6 and Colossians 2 when he's talking about the baptism of the believer. And he says, just as you were buried with Christ in baptism, so you will be raised with him in the resurrection. So the imagery is that just as Jesus was buried, so in your baptism you also are being buried as well. The imagery is there. If Jesus wasn't really buried, the imagery of baptism doesn't make any sense at all. So that's an early tradition to the burial of Jesus. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they talk about the burial of Jesus in detail as well. And in this presentation, I'm not going to go and talk about all of the. I'm not going to try to piece together perfectly and harmonize the burial and the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. I'm not going to do that. All I'm doing today is I just want to prove historically that Jesus was buried. Full stop. That's it. He was given a proper burial. We're going to talk about what that means in a few minutes. The Acts of the Apostles, it talks about Jesus' burial in chapter 13. The Gospel of John. Even if you were really, really limited in how you understand the New Testament, let's say you're the biggest skeptic in the world, and you don't really believe in Q, which is this hypothetical source that Matthew and Luke use that's not Mark's material, you at least have Paul and you have Mark's Gospel at the very minimum. Early independent tradition attests to the burial of Jesus. So it goes back so early. So, what is the basic evidence for the burial of Jesus is this. And this is what you're going to normally hear in apologetics textbooks. And this should be good enough to seal the deal right here. Jesus' burial is attested in multiple independent sources, as I just showed. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 mentions that Paul received the tradition of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection very early. Paul most likely received this tradition from Peter and James within 5 years of Jesus' resurrection, as we learn in Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. And as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is the group we're told in Mark's Gospel, they unanimously voted Jesus down to his death. It's hardly likely that the Christians would have fabricated a tale of a member of the Sanhedrin doing something noble like burying Jesus in his own tomb. Why would they make that up? They wouldn't. And there are no competing burial stories. We have no pagan texts that say, actually, Jesus was thrown in a ditch. Or Jesus was buried in a trench grave. So they dug a grave 6 feet down and put him in that. We have no competing text. In fact, I'm doing my PhD dissertation right now on the topic of the burial of Jesus. And I've researched all the texts that reference the burial of Jesus up into the year 200 AD. I stopped right there because texts up to that point can influence the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that we currently have. But here's something interesting. Despite all of the opponents to Christianity in the first few centuries, like Porphyry, Celsus, Heracles, Julian, and Macarius' anonymous pagan philosopher, none of them dispute that Jesus was buried. They dispute that Jesus was raised from the dead. And they don't even dispute the empty tomb. They say the Christians stole the body or a necromancer came and took it away. They basically confirm that Jesus was buried and the tomb was empty. I don't even know when the earliest reference to somebody doubting that Jesus was buried comes from. I don't know when it started. But what I do know is this. A handful of 21st century skeptics dispute the burial of Jesus. And these are the people we have to deal with because they sell New York Times best-selling books, and a lot of people get duped into their theories, even though they don't hold very much weight. So who are these 21st century skeptics? Well, first off, a friend of mine, Bart Ehrman. My wife Julie and I have actually shared meals with him before, and I hosted a debate between he and Dr. Craig Evans, Nova Scotia, and my wife and I, we had a meal with Bart and his wife Sarah at a nice pub in London, England, where Bart spends his summers. And here's what Bart says in his recent book that just came out a few weeks ago. And his book is titled How Jesus Became God. And in this book, Bart says this, which is kind of a shocker, because this is bizarre. He says, in my judgment, we cannot know that Jesus received a decent burial and that his tomb was later discovered to be empty. This is what Ehrman says. Later on in the book, he says, I think both views, his burial and empty tomb, are unlikely. Now, here's the weird thing about Bart's book. He wrote this book, How Jesus Became God. And in it, he said that it was the belief in the resurrection of Jesus that kickstarted the whole idea that Jesus was in some sense divine. Now, okay, just let that pass for a second. If that's the case, why did he need to Bart spent 2 chapters in his book basically talking about the resurrection, the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, and showing why it's historically unlikely. He didn't even need to write those chapters. It doesn't really help his case. It doesn't add anything to his book. It's sort of like the book, The Empty Tomb by the skeptics, Jeffrey J. Lauder and who's the other, Robert Price. And, the first half of the book, they argued that Jesus didn't exist. And then the second half of the book, they said, and he didn't rise from the dead either. So this is Bart. Bart's recycling the views from 20 years ago of John Dominic Crossan. And here's what Crossan says. He says, with regard to the body of Jesus, by Easter Sunday morning, those who cared did not know where it was, and those who knew did not care. So this is nothing new. These ideas have been floating around for at least 20 years. So it's important that we understand that, we really need to know what the evidence is for the burial of Jesus, other than just that nice list that I gave. Because we need to look at the criticisms that Ehrman and Crossan are leveling against the reliability of the burial narrative. And we need to see where their arguments are, and we need to pick it apart. That's what I'm going to do in the remaining part of this presentation. So what did Jews believe about the burial of the executed? Well, that's important. When we go back into the Old Testament, very early material, we read in Numbers that the wicked who persecuted Israel, that they were to be granted burial. You buried the wicked. And we're later told even more in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy tells us this. It says, and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him that same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So it's interesting to note in this passage, it goes right back into some of the earliest books of the Old Testament, that Jews believed that the executed should be buried, not out of respect to the dead person, because they deserved their fate. They were accursed by God. They were to be buried before the sun went down so that the land wouldn't be defiled, because the land was sacred and given to them as inheritance from Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. That's why people were to be buried before sundown. That's why it was considered a disgrace to leave a corpse unburied. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it was considered astonishing that the pagans wouldn't bury the people they executed. It was an atrocity because it just defiled the land. We read about in 1 Kings 11:15 that even Israel's enemies were to be buried before the sun went down so the land wouldn't be defiled. Even in Ezekiel 39, the eschatological enemy Gog were given proper burials after that great battle so that the land wouldn't be defiled. This goes all the way throughout the Old Testament. Even the first century Jewish historian Josephus. So this isn't just tradition that existed hundreds and hundreds of years before the time of Jesus and Jews stopped believing in this and would be happy leaving a corpse thrown into a ditch. No. The first century Jewish historian Josephus says this: Jews must furnish fire, water, food to all who ask for them, and to point out the road where they need to go, and not to leave a corpse unburied, and to show consideration even for declared enemies. It's extremely important tradition. This is a first century Jewish historian, but when he was working for the Roman Empire. The first century Jewish philosopher Philo says this in the fictitious account of Jacob's grief upon hearing falsely that Joseph had been killed by wild animals and was not buried. Philo recounts the patriarch saying that even the cruelest of men would have taken pity and deemed the custom of burial to be its due. So the exception to the rule was somebody that was not buried before the sun went down. The rule was that the person was buried. So what was Jewish burial practices in the time of Jesus? So when we read the Gospels, so Jesus' body is taken down from his cross. And so it's Good Friday. He's taken down from the cross, and then it says that he was wrapped and he was anointed with spices and perfumes, and he was laid in a tomb. So what's going on here? Well, Jews did something called secondary burial, also called ossuagium. Here's what they would do. They would take the body of the deceased, they would lay them in a tomb, and they would leave the body there to decompose for about a year to a year and a half. All the flesh and sinews would all waste away, and all that would be left were bones. I know it's kind of gross, because somehow Jews believe that the bones, just like in Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones, the bones, the sinews, eventually at the resurrection, the bones would stand back up, and the sinews and flesh would grow over them again, and the person would be raised from the dead. That imagery overflowed even to their burial practices. So they would bury a year later, they'd gather the bones of the deceased and they'd place them in an ossuary. But before we get to that, you can see in this picture here, you have the dead body on the ledge, and you have a bunch of perfume bottles on the floor and broken pottery. This is what the inside of a first century tomb would sort of look like, to some degree. So the body's laid out, it's decomposed. Why did they anoint Jesus' body for burial? Why did they put perfume and spices on it? Because Jews had a mourning period of about 7 days after the person died. They would even hire professional mourners. So if you couldn't cry anymore, your tear ducts stopped crying, they'd have somebody that come in and keep crying for you, and you paid them to cry. Seriously, they had professional mourners. So they would mourn over the dead body for 7 days. Around day 3 or 4, what starts to happen? It starts to stink. That's why they're perfuming the body. When the woman went to the tomb on Easter Sunday, they weren't expecting Jesus to be raised from the dead. They're going to add more perfume. They're going to start the mourning process. They're starting to weep over Jesus' body and follow through with Jewish burial practices. They were not expecting Jesus to be raised. So the process of ossulegium, secondary burial, is quite likely already implied. It's already in action in the burial of Jesus, because that's what they were going to do with him. So here's an ossuary. People who are more wealthy, this is actually the ossuary. This is the coffin of Caiaphas. I took this picture at the Israel Museum, and his actual ossuary. That's the coffin of the high priest who condemned Jesus to death. That's it right there. So what they would do is they'd gather the bones about a year later, put them in one of those. Now, it's important to get this part right, because a number of scholars give conflicting views on this. Was given a dishonor. Was considered being buried in your own family's tomb in your hometown. That's an honorable burial. A dishonorable burial, in my opinion, is when you'd be discarded, not buried properly. You'd be thrown into a ditch. That would be a dishonorable burial. Now, a proper burial is what happened to Jesus. Jesus was not really given an honorable burial, even though it says that Joseph buried him in his own tomb and in all the burial ointments and the cloth. That's just proper burial practices. That's proper. Jesus was given a proper burial, not dishonorable and not honorable. He was given proper burial. The Mishnah says this. It says in the Mishnah was a collection of Jewish rabbinic tradition that was compiled around the year AD 200. And it says this: they did not bury the executed criminal in the burying place of his fathers, but 2 burying places were kept in readiness by the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin's job was to bury the deceased. And so even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find more evidence that those who were executed were to be given proper burials. The Dead Sea Scrolls were composed a couple hundred years or so before the time to exist, around when the Romans sacked the area, around 70 or so. And very interesting thing is it possible that the burial of crucifixion victims is in view in the temple scroll? I think it's likely. But let's take a look. Here's Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 to 23. This is just the normal what you'll find in your Bible. And it says this: and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death. So first off, he's already put to death, and you hang him on a tree. So he's put to death, then you hang him on a tree so other people can see the guy's dead body. Basically as a sign, don't be like this bonehead. And you hang him on a tree. His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hangman is accursed by God. You shall not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. That's just Deuteronomy 21, verse 22 to 23. It says, in the Greek, it says, kremaste auton episulu. So, and you hang him on a tree after he's already dead. That's probably what's going on here. But when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually switches. There's a change that happens. The Temple Scroll says this. So instead of the person being executed, then hung, and then buried before the sun went down, the order is actually reversed. It says, if a man is a traitor against his people and gives them up to a foreign nation, so doing evil to his people, You are to hang him on a tree until dead. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses he will be put to death, and they themselves shall hang him on the tree. If a man is convicted of a capital crime and flees to the nations, cursing his people and the children of Israel, you are to hang him also upon a tree until dead. But you must not let their bodies remain on the tree overnight. You shall most certainly bury them that very day. Indeed, anyone hung on a tree is accursed of God and men, but you are not to defile the land that I am about to give you as an inheritance. The Dead Sea Scroll, actually, the Temple Scroll alters Deuteronomy 21. And the term to be hanged or suspended was the same word used for crucifixion. As long as the person is up, it could be crucifixion. So we know that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were being written, hundreds of people, or hundreds of Jews have already been crucified. So they understand crucifixion. When the Qumran community knew of crucifixion practices going on. And Jews were being crucified. But they were given proper burials before the sun would go down. So it's quite likely that the Temple Scroll is alluding to the idea that crucified people were to be buried before the sun would go down. So what about archaeological evidence for the burial of executed criminals? So we have a bunch of literary texts, but do the literary texts actually line up with what we discover from archaeology? Let's take a look. Excuse me. This is the heel bone of a crucified man. His name is Yehohanan because in his ossuary, his name, Yehohanan, was carved into the side of his ossuary, scratched in probably with a nail. And I took this picture at Tel Aviv University, the University of Tel Aviv, where this is the authentic heel bone of Yehohanan. It's being studied by Dr. Israel Hershkovitz, who's a physical anthropologist at the Sackler Science Medical Center at the University of Tel Aviv, and he's a physical anthropologist. All the bones that they discover in archaeological digs in Israel, of those who died, whether through traumatic deaths or whatever, they all go through him. So Hershkovitz, he studies the bones of the deceased. So here we have the heel bone of Yehohanan. In 1968, in the area known as Givat HaMivtar in Jerusalem, a district of Jerusalem in Israel, a number of ancient Jewish tombs were discovered, dating from around 200 BC until about 100 AD. So around the time of Jesus, give or take 100 years in each end. So inside this tomb were discovered numerous ossuaries, so bone boxes, coffins containing the remains of the deceased. Now inside one of the tombs was a particular ossuary containing the remains of a man in his mid-20s, along with the remains of a child aged 3 or 4. It's very sad, but in ossuaries we discover tons of bones of children. Child mortality, children died very young in antiquity. The mortality rates were extremely high. It was actually a good time for Jesus to actually enter into humanity and to start healing people. When we know that at least 25% of people in the first century had some sort of debilitating illness. We can see this because we can see the diseases in their bones discovered in ossuaries. What a time for the Son of God to come and actually heal people and do miracles. To enter into a time when medical doctors were normally thought as quacks. They would literally drill holes in people's heads to get rid of headaches. Or they thought that they could get rid of evil spirits by drilling holes in people. Oof. What a time for Jesus to come. So anyways, what they discovered in the ossuary along the bones of Yehohanan were his heel bone. And in the heel bone was lodged an 11.5 centimeter iron spike or nail. And the reason why we even have it, because first off, let's get something straight. It's amazing that we have any evidence of crucifixion at all in the archaeological record. Why? Because the Romans practiced the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. They would extract the crucifixion nails out of the victim and use them again on the next guy. They didn't just throw out the nails for cleanliness purposes. They'd use them again. But with Yehohanan, the reason why we have his heel bone with the nail still intact is because the nail is hooked at the end. So when they tried to get Yehohanan's foot off the cross, they couldn't yank it out because it was hooked. So they just decided, let's just chop the guy's ankle bone with the nail intact and throw it throw it in his tomb, and eventually found its way into the ossuary. It's a fluke that we even have archaeological evidence of crucifixion at all in this example of Yehohanan. It's amazing. Here's a flawed sketch of crucifixion you'll sometimes see on the internet. The guy's arms are behind the cross. It's anatomically impossible for that to happen. Arms don't wrap around crosses like that. And Yehohanan, just if you want to know, he's about 5.5 feet, 5'5", and a 50-year-old woman who was also buried in the tomb, she was about 4'10". And so you'll notice in the picture there, the foot on this side, so Yehohanan's right foot, it shows the hooked nail. And that's the way he was probably crucified. Yehohanan was probably straddling the cross. Now here's sort of a misconception a lot of people have. Most depictions of Jesus being crucified, his hands are in front of the cross like this. You know what I mean? So there's the wood, and Jesus' right hand is here. And we have hardly any evidence that ropes were used in crucifixion. So how did Jesus stay on the cross with the nail through there, or even through here? Well, what we know now is that that's probably not how they crucified people. Jesus' hands were probably behind the cross, on the backside of the cross, or they were on top of the cross to hold the weight. But there's almost no way his hands would have been in front of the cross like this. So the nails would have went from the back of the hand forward so that the person could actually hold the pressure of themselves on the cross. That's how people were probably crucified. Craig Evans thinks people were crucified with their arms on top of the crosses like this because they could hold the weight. So they could push up and breathe. So that's what we know there. In fact, this is really gross, but on another expedition, there's a scholar who's actually working on studying crucifixion, and he's actually crucifying cadavers. And it's pretty gross, and that's how he knew. That's how we now know that the nails probably did not go through here or through here. They went from the back forward because they've done experiments on cadavers. They've crucified people that died. Imagine that. When you die, you give your body to science, and they crucify you for experimentation. It's kind of weird. So we also have other examples of people who were executed and were given proper burial. At Givat HaMiktar, once again, were found the remains of a woman who had been decapitated, and we also, in another tomb further down in the same area, were the remains of a man who also had been decapitated. This woman here, the picture on the left, her elbow bone was sheared off, and she was also decapitated. So she was probably murdered, not executed. Because if it's a state execution, you wouldn't find chops off the elbows. She probably was shielding herself from a guy who was attacking her, who wanted to kill her, and then chopped off part of the elbow, and then the guy finally got the head off. It's possible that the man that they found buried in the tomb a few doors down from hers, who was decapitated, he might have murdered her, and then they gave him a proper execution. But here's the thing. Both of them were given proper burials. We found their bones in ossuaries and tombs. They were executed. So they were given proper burials as well. So we have evidence for this. We also have new archaeological evidence for the burial of a crucified man. Now, here's the thing. Is it possible that the remains of Mattathias Antigonus, the last member of the Hasmonean dynasty, that his remains have been found? And this is really interesting because if this is true, then the remains that we have of Mattathias Antigonus are just as important as the remains of Yehohanan with the nail through his heel bone. Because Mattathias Antigonus, as I'm going to show in a couple independent traditions, one tradition said that he was decapitated, the other one said that he was crucified. And for a long time, scholars thought, like Bart Ehrman always does in debates, he always says, well, it says this in one gospel, it says this in another gospel. They both can't be right. Well, a lot of scholars took that same logic, and they said, well, it says that Mattathias Antigonus was decapitated in one source and says he was crucified in another. They both can't be right. Wait, hold on to that for a second. So here we are, Craig Evans in the middle, and Dr. Israel Hershkovitz. He's the expert on ancient bones and traumatic deaths from the past. He's on the right, and here's me with my baseball hat on backwards. It was a hot day, so I didn't wear a suit or anything. So here we are in Israel's office, and I'm learning all this for the first time, and Craig Evans is learning this too, and his jaw just broke off his face. So here's what we know. We have, once again in the area of Givat HaMiktar in Jerusalem, in 1970, a cave was discovered. Now inside this cave there was a Paleo-Hebrew inscription, and that's the inscription right there. I'm going to read the inscription to you in a minute. Also discovered in this cave were nails with human bone residue attached to them. Interesting. and also skeletal remains. So we actually have the skeletal remains that clearly show that the guy who's in there, that his head was chopped off, went through the head and then cut through the mandible bone of the jaw and went through. That's how the guy ended up dying. Or at least that's how we have his remains. His head was chopped off. So in 1974, a scholar named J.M. Grintz argued that this was the tomb of Mattathias Antigonus, who was who was crucified and decapitated. Now, by the way, you guys are some of the only people on the planet that know about this right now. This is really recent revelation that not very many people know of. So you're going to hear about this more, because everyone always talks about Yehohanan's heel bone is basically all we've got. No, not even close. Grintz argued that Mattathias Antigonus' remains are in this cave. It's called the Abba Cave, and I'll show you why in a second. Now, another famous archaeologist, Niku Haas, in that same year, read over what Grintz argued and said, you know what, he's right. He did his archaeological work right. He looked at the literary texts. This makes sense. These are most likely, quite plausibly, the actual remains of Mattathias Antigonus, which is further evidence those who were executed were given proper burial in antiquity. Now, it was only recently, like a year ago, in 2013, a Jewish scholar named Yoel Elitzur, he recently confirmed the views of Grintz and Haas. So why did we go all this time? Why have scholars not even known about this? That's a good question, isn't it? We always talk about Yehohanan's heel bone with the nail through it as the only evidence we have of crucifixion in the ancient world. But why don't scholars ever talk about this? Well, I'm going to tell you why. In 1977, Patricia Smith, she was a scholar who studied what she thought were the remains of Mattathias Antigonus from the Abba Cave. She misidentified the significance of the tomb and misled an entire generation of scholars who didn't even give this any consideration, ever since she wrote an article in the Israel Exploration Journal in 1977. She described the skeleton that she was studying as belonging to a small, elderly woman, not a tall, young man. And she said the nails that she saw had nothing to do with crucifixion. However, archaeologists now believe she was looking in the wrong box and studied remains completely unrelated to the Abba Cave. Because if you go into archaeologists' offices sometimes, they have boxes piled up all over the place. Sometimes with a little piece of white masking tape with a little note on it. Sometimes they don't even have a note on the masking tape. And unfortunately, Niku Haas, who was studying the remains of Mattathias Antigonus, he died, so she took over studying the remains, and a whole bunch of his boxes from his office got shipped over to her, and they were unlabeled. She was probably studying the wrong box, because both Niku Haas and, who's the other guy, Grintz, they both said that the remains they were studying were of a tall young man, not a short elderly woman. And it's only been until a year ago, Yoel Elitzur studied all this and said she was studying the wrong thing. The remains of Mattathias Antigonus were most likely discovered in that tomb, so in that cave. So here's what the inscription says, the Abba Cave inscription. It says this. Here's an English translation. Can everybody read that with me? I am Abba, son of the priest Eleazar, son of Aaron the Great. I am Abba, the oppressed, the persecuted, who was born in Jerusalem and went into Babylonia and carried up for interment Mattathiah, son of Judah. That's the exact name of that's Mattathiah Antigonus. He was the son of Judah. And I buried him in the cave which I purchased by the writ. Interesting. So he tells us he married a guy named Mattathiah, son of Judah. And we have the remains of a guy who was decapitated, and we actually have the nails with metacarpal bone attached to them. There you go. Here's what the ancient texts tell us. Here's where some of the disagreement among scholars came. Josephus recounts that Marcus Antonius beheaded Antigonus in Antioch. Josephus says this in Antiquities 15:8-9. Now, Cassius Dio says something different, and here's where the tension for scholars began. Cassius Dio seems to contradict Josephus by stating that Antigonus was crucified. However, the full statement can be harmonized with Josephus. And here, if you listen to the whole statement, I think it can be harmonized quite well. Antony bound Antigonus to a cross and flogged him, a punishment no other king had suffered at the hands of the Romans. And afterwards, he slew him. What does that mean, he slew him? Maybe it means he was crucified, and then afterwards they chopped his head off. That's probably what it means. So now, scholars now believe, archaeologists who have been studying this, we're now quite certain that we've actually discovered the tomb of Mattathias Antigonus, who was crucified and decapitated and given a proper burial, not thrown in a ditch, eaten by wild dogs. I mean, this is what John Dominic Crossan's theory is, that Jesus was most likely not given a proper burial. This is what Ehrman resurrects, bad use of the word resurrects, around Easter. But, he said Jesus' body was probably taken down from his cross. And the chapter title in Crossan's book is "The Dogs Beneath the Cross." Is Jesus' body was most likely taken down from his cross, thrown in a ditch, and to be picked apart and eaten by wild dogs, or picked apart by carrion crows. Well, think about this: the Jewish high feast, Passover. It's peacetime in Israel. Passover's going on. All the people are buying their sacrifice in Jerusalem. Can you imagine a dog, running into Jerusalem with like a piece of human flesh in his mouth, or a bird flying over the temple and just sometimes birds will drop stuff on the ground. A bird drops a piece of human on the temple. That would be disgusting. That would be considered outrageous and an atrocity in the Jewish world. They would have been furious because Jews were very finicky about making sure the body was buried so the land wouldn't be defiled, especially around Jerusalem, the holy city, during peacetime, during Passover. It's ridiculous when you think about it. Did the Romans encourage the burial of the executed during peacetime? This is an important thing because Bart Ehrman in his book says the Romans could care less about Jewish sensitivities. They didn't care at all. Yeah, but what were Roman sensitivities for burying the executed? What do we know? Well, the Digesta, which is a collection of juristic writings, mostly dating back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it says this. It says, quote, "The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused to their relatives. And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. At present," this is important, "the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted." Permission was asked for to bury Jesus' body by Joseph of Arimathea. And sometimes, the quote continues, "sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can be claimed, in order that their bones and ashes, after having been collected, may be buried. The bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial." Digesta 4824, line 1 and 3. That's one passage right there. Here's what else Philo says about the Romans. He says this. He stated that the Romans normally did, quote, "not disturb the customs which throughout all the preceding ages have been safeguarded without disturbance by kings and by emperors." The Romans didn't want to tick off the Jews. They wanted peace in that time, especially before 70. This is the year 30 during peacetime in Jerusalem. Last thing the Romans wanted to do was to instigate anger amongst the Jews during Passover and start lots of bloodshed and war. Why did Pilate have Jesus crucified in the first place? He finally relented and said, fine, it's better that one man should die than basically a rebellion break out and a whole bunch of people die and there's a bunch of bloodshed in the street. My hands are covered in blood. They wanted to avoid confrontation. Flavius Josephus, once again, he says this. He says, quote, "and he worked for the Romans. He said the Romans did not require their, quote, their subjects to violate their national laws." That's an against Appian. Later on, he says this. "By abstaining from all interference with the customs of the country, the Romans kept the nation at peace. These customs included never leaving a corpse unburied." Against Appian 2, verse 11. By the way, guess how many of these sources Bart Ehrman and John Dominic Crossan cite in their academic works? In Ehrman's recent chapter on the burial of Jesus and how Jesus became God, guess how many times he cites any of these passages that I just showed you? 0. Goose egg. I gotta say this. I consider Bart to be a friend, but for the first time in my life, I would say he's intentionally misleading his readers because he darn well knows these texts exist and they go against his theory and they damage the credibility of his argument. He's being deceptive, and I'm saying this on live camera. Bart Ehrman is being deceptive. He knows better. He holds a PhD and teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has classes with hundreds of students every year. His New Testament introduction textbook is the one that I read when I took New Testament intro at St. Mary's University. He knows better. He knows these texts exist, and he doesn't cite them once in his book. And he argues elaborate case why Jesus was probably not buried. And he says, the evidence that we have, he says, all of the evidence we have says that the Romans didn't care about Jewish sensitivities, and Jesus would not have been granted a proper burial, but was probably thrown in a ditch, or whatever Dom Crossan says. That's bad scholarship, and that's being dishonest. Sorry, I'm just getting emotional here. Craig Evans says this, and this is the book that Zondervan put out, the exact time that Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, came out. Zondervan had a rebuttal book. These scholars were allowed to read Ehrman's book a few months before it came out. They were allowed to write a contra book to it, and it's called How God Became Jesus. And it's a number of excellent scholars. I highly recommend the book, but in one of the chapters, Evans cites a lot of the evidence that I'm doing in this presentation, why Ehrman's just off the wall. And he says this is what Craig Evans says. He says, every source we have indicates that the burial of the executed before sundown, was the practice in Israel, especially in the vicinity of Jerusalem during peacetime. War was another matter of course. When Titus besieged Jerusalem from 69 to 70 CE, so 40 years after Jesus, thousands of Jews were crucified and very few of them were buried. Yeah, this is true. This is at war, not during peacetime, at war, 70. The whole point of not burying them was to terrorize the resistance and bring the rebellion to an end. This was the true exception that proves the rule. So, when the Romans finally had as much of the Jews as they could take, and they finally sacked Jerusalem in 70 to tick off the Jews because they knew the Jews were crazy about burying the executed, they left all the bodies scattered all over the place to tick them off, to infuriate them. That was the exception to the rule. We have a longer passage in Josephus. I want to read it. It's going to take a minute, but I think it's a very important passage. Here's what it says. This is the true exception to the rule. Josephus' Jewish War 4:310 to 17. The Zealots also joined in the shouts raised by the Idumeans, and the storm itself rendered the cry more terrible. Nor did the Idumeans spare anyone, for as they are naturally a most barbarous and bloody nation, and had been distressed by the tempest, they made use of their weapons against those who would shut the gates against them, and acted in the same manner as to those that supplicated for their lives, and to those who fought them, insomuch that they ran through those with their swords, who desired them to remember the relation there was between them, and begged of them to have regard for their common temple. Now there was at present neither any place for flight, nor any hope of preservation, but as they were driven one upon another in heaps, so were they slain. Thus the greater part were driven together by force, as there was now no place of retirement, and the murderers were upon them, and having no other way, threw themselves down headlong into the city, whereby, in my opinion, they underwent a more miserable death than that which they avoided, because that was a voluntary one. And now the outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood. And that day, as it came on, they saw 8,500 dead bodies there. But the rage of the Idumeans was not satiated by these slaughters, but they now betook themselves to the city and plundered every house and slew everyone they met. And for the other multitude they esteemed it needless to go on with killing them, but they sought for the high priests and generally went with the greatest zeal against them. And as soon as they caught them, they slew them, and then standing upon their dead bodies in way of jest, upbraided Antigonus with his kindness to the people, and another Jesus, with his speech made to them from the wall. Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. Quite a passage. I want to give the final quote of my presentation to somebody who teaches at Bart Ehrman's own university. Her name is Jody Magnus. She's a world-class archaeologist. She's an expert in Jewish burial practices. By the way, in Bart's chapter on the burial of Jesus in his book, and it's a pretty long chapter too, guess how many times Bart Ehrman cites Jody Magnus, the world expert who he hired to teach at the University of North Carolina? 0. Guess how many times Bart Ehrman cites Byron McCain, who's a world expert on Jewish burial practices and the burial of Jesus? 0. Guess how many times Bart cites Eric Myers, who's an expert on ossuaries and Jewish burial practices in antiquity? 0. Guess how many times Bart Ehrman acknowledges or even cites Craig Evans? 0. The list goes on and on. Shimon Gibson, Jewish archaeologist. His book is fantastic. How many times does he cite Shimon Gibson? He doesn't. Bart doesn't cite any scholars who are experts on Jewish burial in his chapter. None. Now I'm going to let the final words of my presentation be from a writing of Jody Magnus, whose door is just down the hall from Bart's. I wish Bart would have at least read some of her work because it would have changed his chapter a lot. And here's what she says. She says, "Today, many scholars believe that since crucifixion was a sadistic and humiliating form of corporal punishment reserved by the Romans for the lower classes, including slaves, Jesus died a criminal's death on the tree of shame. John Dominic Crossan, and I add, and now Bart Ehrman, for example, argues that Jesus would not have been buried at all, but would have been eaten by dogs. In my opinion," and she's an expert, "the notion that Jesus was unburied or buried in disgrace is based on a misunderstanding of the archaeological evidence and of Jewish law. I believe that the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence and with Jewish law." She's written a lot on the burial of Jesus. And she's very good. And she knows her stuff. She knows about Josephus and Philo. She knows about the Digesta. She knows about all the ancient texts. She knows the archaeological evidence. Ehrman doesn't. His chapter is a joke. So in this presentation, I've shown that the evidence for the burial of Jesus is extremely solid. And although it's not considered one of the minimal facts, it should be. We should make it a 6th fact, because without the burial, you don't have an empty tomb. So I consider this the 2nd fact. Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, and then onwards with the resurrection and the empty tomb. Let's pray. Lord, I want to thank you that as Christians, we do not need to put our heads in the sand, and that we should be the first people to go towards the truth, even if it impacts some of our understandings of Scripture or our own beliefs. And Lord, it's amazing how skeptics always criticize Christians for not being open-minded, and then we read stuff by skeptics where they do botched historical work and mislead thousands of people. Lord, I just want to pray for anybody watching this online or anybody here in this church right now who might have doubts about the Christian faith. Lord, I pray that those doubts would wash away as they on their own journey search for you through the historical record and look into the historical veracity of the Christian faith. Thank you, Jesus, that you have not left us without a witness, that we have the New Testament that preserves very accurately what we know about your life, death, burial, and resurrection. And this time, 2,000 years ago, you were still chilling out in the tomb. And then tomorrow, your tomb became empty. Pray all this in your name. Amen.